The gavel cracked through the air like a gunshot. The entire courtroom jolted, heads whipping toward the bench where Judge Thomas leaned forward, eyes cold, voice dripping with the kind of power that never asks. It commands. $500 million. The words didn't hang. They slammed into the room, echoing with a finality that made even seasoned attorneys shift in their seats. A $500 million fine. Against one woman. Against Jasmine Crockett. Gasps rolled across the gallery, a wave of disbelief that swelled into murmurs, then silence, then stunned stares fixed on the Congresswoman at the defense table. For a moment, even the air seemed to betray her, growing, heavy, with the weight of an impossible number. Crockett did not flinch. She sat there, shoulders squared, eyes locked on the man who had just attempted to bury her with a sentence meant to break not just her finances, but her spirit. Around her, aides froze, hands gripping pens, jaws tight with anger they dared not release. The spectators leaned forward, almost hungry, as though they knew history had just been written in the stroke of a gavel. Thomas's expression revealed no hesitation, no mercy. If anything, there was satisfaction, an arrogance so casual it was chilling. To him, this was the silencing of a voice that had grown too loud, too fearless, too unwilling to bow to men like him. For those watching, it felt like a line had been crossed, a moment where the machinery of power exposed itself without disguise. $500 million wasn't justice. It was a message, a warning, an attempt to crush the audacity of a woman who refused to look away when corruption stood in plain sight. Whispers carried through the benches. Did he really say 500 million? How is that even possible? Reporters scribbled furiously, cameras clicking, trying to capture the look on Crockett's face. But what they saw wasn't fear. It was calculation, because Jasmine Crockett understood something Judge Thomas did not. Fines and threats could reach her wallet, her reputation, even her career, but they could not touch her resolve, and while Thomas believed he had delivered the final word, the courtroom was about to discover that silence can be far louder than a gavel. But what Crockett did next didn't just save her career, it turned the entire courtroom upside down. To understand the gravity of that $500 million ruling, you have to understand who sat on each side of the courtroom. On one side, Clarence Thomas, one of the most powerful men in America, cloaked in the authority of the highest court in the Hawaii land. On the other, Jasmine Crockett, a first-term congresswoman from Texas, a woman who built her name not through wealth or privilege, but through grit, sharp wit, and an unwavering refusal to be silent. This wasn't just about money. It was about the audacity of power and the resilience of those who dare to confront it. Thomas's career has been shadowed for decades by whispers that turned into headlines. Luxury vacations gifted by billionaires, conflicts of interest ignored, rulings that tilted the scales toward those already holding the reins. To his critics, he had become the embodiment of arrogance, an untouchable figure who saw himself less as a servant of justice and more as a king on a throne. In that courtroom, the fine he leveled against Crockett wasn't a legal penalty. It was a message. I am beyond challenge. But then there was Crockett. She was no stranger to uphill battles. She didn't come from the gilded hallways of generational privilege. Her voice was forged in the fire of community struggles, sharpened on the debate floor, and amplified in the congressional hearings, where she had already built a reputation for cutting through pretense with surgical precision. She was, to her, supporters, the very definition of a fighter, unapologetic, authentic, unwilling to yield. And that is what made this clash feel bigger than one case. For millions watching, Crockett wasn't just Jasmine Crockett. She was every woman who had ever been told to sit down and stay quiet. Every immigrant who had ever been told they didn't belong. Every underdog who had ever stood toe-to-toe with someone the system had already decided was untouchable. The fine was a weapon, yes, but it was also a spark. People left that courtroom seething. Outrage poured into text messages, news alerts, and whispered conversations in church basements and barbershops. Was this justice? Or was this what happened when a powerful man believed no one could stop him? And for Crockett herself, the stakes were impossible to ignore. Pay the fine, and it would cripple her career, drain her resources, and silence her voice at the very moment it was needed most. Refuse, and she risked contempt, prison, or worse. Either way, the system seemed engineered to break her. But here was the truth Thomas hadn't calculated for. Crockett had never built her life on what she could lose. She built it on what she refused to surrender: dignity, truth, and the stubborn belief that when you fight not just for yourself, but for the people watching you, defeat isn't an option. The courtroom thought the battle had been decided the moment the gavel came down, but they were wrong, because Jasmine Crockett was about to remind Clarence Thomas and everyone else in that room that power without accountability is a house built on sand. And when Thomas thought he had her cornered, Crockett revealed a card he never saw coming. To see Clarence Thomas on that bench was to see decades of power calcified into one man. He sat there draped not only in a judge's robe but in a lifetime of decisions, scandals and entitlements that had made him more myth than man in Washington. To his admirers, he was immovable. To his critics, he was untouchable. And yet, in that moment, the arrogance radiating from his smirk suggested something more dangerous. He believed himself to be invincible. The fine he imposed on Jasmine Crockett was not born in a vacuum. It was the latest chapter in a story that had been writing itself since the earliest controversies of his career. People remembered the whispers from the 1990s, the bruising confirmation hearings that left the country divided. They remembered how, time and again, Thomas had weathered storms that would have destroyed another public figure. Each scandal seemed only to harden him, each headline another stone in the fortress of immunity he built around himself. In recent years, the fortress had grown gilded. Reports surfaced of luxury trips, private yachts, and opulent vacations, funded not from his own pocket, but from billionaires eager to curry favor with a Supreme Court justice. While ordinary Americans counted every dollar and worried about the price of groceries, Thomas dined under chandeliers in private resorts, his expenses absorbed by men whose fortunes depended on the very decisions his gavel could influence. And, when critics demanded accountability, he brushed them off with the casual disdain of a man who no longer recognized the difference between privilege and entitlement. Rules, disclosures, codes of ethics, those were for others. For Thomas, the robe was not a symbol of service, but a shield, one that made him impervious to the accountability he demanded from everyone else. It was this posture of arrogance that defined his actions in the courtroom against Crockett. To him, she was not an opponent. She was an inconvenience. A rising voice, sharp and unflinching, who dared to speak truths others only whispered. Her presence was a reminder that power, no matter how entrenched, could still be questioned. And for a man like Thomas, That was intolerable. The $500 million fine was his answer. Not a legal ruling so much as an act of humiliation. It was a performance meant to crush her, to send a message to anyone who might follow her lead. This is what happens when you step out of line. He could have chosen a smaller penalty, a symbolic gesture, or even a sharp rebuke. Instead, he chose to wield the gavel like a weapon, the sound of it striking wood echoing like a warning shot through the chamber. In that moment, his smirk said more than his ruling. It was the smile of a man who had spent decades bending the system to his will, who believed himself untouchable because he had always emerged unscathed. Each scandal, each headline, each question about his integrity, none had ever truly threatened him. Why should this be any different? Whispers ran through the gallery. They spoke of the trips, the gifts, the conflicts of interest swept neatly under the rug. They spoke of a justice who seemed less concerned with the law than with the privileges it afforded him. To them, the fine wasn't just about Crockett. It was proof of a man who had stopped seeing the people he was sworn to serve. A man who now served only himself. And yet, in his certainty, Thomas had made a miscalculation. He believed Crockett would break under the weight of the fine, that her shoulders would sag and her voice would falter. He believed the courtroom would witness another underdog crushed by the inevitability of power. But Clarence Thomas had never stood in her shoes. He had never fought to be heard in rooms designed to silence her. He had never lived with the knowledge that one mistake, one slip, one refusal to bow could end a career before it began. And he had never known the kind of resolve born from generations of struggle, the kind of resilience that does not retreat in the face of arrogance, but rises to meet it. For all his power, Clarence Thomas never understood the strength of a woman who had fought her entire life to be in that room. Long before Jasmine Crockett ever stepped into that courtroom, before the cameras and headlines and impossible fines, she had learned what it meant to fight. Her story did not begin with power. It began with resistance. She was born and raised in Texas, the daughter of a working family who taught her that nothing worth having would ever be handed to her. She grew up in a world where the playing field was tilted, where voices like hers, black, female, unapologetic, were often dismissed before they were even heard. Yet even as a child, there was a fire in her. Teachers remembered her speaking up when others stayed silent. Friends remembered her standing between bullies and their targets, daring anyone to cross her. College sharpened that fire into focus. Law school gave her the tools to channel it. She didn't chase the most lucrative firms or the easiest paths. She took the cases others avoided. Criminal defense, civil rights. Clients who could barely afford a lawyer, let alone a champion. She walked into courtrooms where her clients were written off before the first argument was made, and she refused to let the system swallow them whole. It wasn't glamorous. The hours were long, the pay was meager, and the obstacles were constant. But every victory, no matter how small, was proof that dignity could be defended, even against impossible odds. Crockett was carving out not just a career, but a calling. To stand where others were afraid to stand, and to speak when silence seemed safer. Politics came almost by accident. She hadn't dreamed of the marble halls of Congress. But when her community needed someone to represent them with honesty and grit, when people demanded a fighter instead of another polished face reciting safe talking points, she answered the call. She ran for the Texas House and won. And in those chambers, her reputation grew quickly. Unyielding, razor sharp, unwilling to play by the rules of decorum when those rules were designed to silence truth. When she later made it to Congress, the national stage only amplified what Texas had already seen. She took her seat in hearings, where intimidation was the currency and arrogance the language of the powerful. And there, Crockett thrived. She asked the questions others tiptoed around. She cut through evasions with a tone that was both lawyerly and laced with a moral clarity that could not be rehearsed. Clips of her fiery exchanges ricocheted across social media, earning her both critics and admirers, but never leaving anyone indifferent. For her supporters, she was not just another politician. She was proof that authenticity could survive in Washington, that someone could bring both intellect and passion into a room designed to crush individuality, that you didn't have to be born into privilege to speak truth in the halls of power. And what made her different was not just her words, but her presence. Crockett never masked who she was. She embraced her identity, the accent, the style, the directness, elements others might have tried to sand down in pursuit of approval. She wore them as armor. She refused to apologize for being both brilliant and blunt, both commanding and deeply human. Of course, that authenticity drew enemies. For every admirer who saw her as the people's champion, there were critics who bristled at her refusal to bow. They labeled her angry, loud, disrespectful. The same tired tropes hurled at women of color for daring to claim space. But Crockett turned those labels into fuel. Each attack only underscored why her voice was necessary. Each insult only proved the power of her presence. It was this history, this life of struggle, resilience, and unapologetic truth that she carried with her into the courtroom against Clarence Thomas. She was not intimidated by the grandeur of the chamber or the authority of the robe. She had walked into hostile rooms her entire life. She had fought for clients with no money, no privilege, no power, and she had refused to yield then. Why would she yield now? As she sat at that table, listening to Thomas declare a fine so obscene it bordered on parody, Crockett was not just hearing a number. She was hearing every dismissal she had ever endured, every attempt to silence her, every barrier that had been placed in her path. The $500 million was not just an attack on her career, it was an attack on everything she represented, and that is why her face did not crack, why her posture did not sag, why even as the murmurs swelled around her, she looked straight ahead with eyes that betrayed no fear. Because Crockett understood the weight of that moment. She knew the cameras were rolling. She knew her supporters were watching. She knew that millions of Americans, especially women, especially people of color, especially the ones who had been told all their lives to stay in their place, were holding their breath with her. This was not just her fight anymore, it was theirs. And when the $500 million bombshell dropped, Crockett knew she couldn't just fight for herself. She had to fight for everyone watching. The courtroom air thickened as Clarence Thomas leaned forward, his voice cutting like a blade through the heavy silence he had created. He began with a flood of accusations, his tone steeped in authority, his words wrapped in the precision of legal jargon that only he seemed to believe could mask their hollowness. He cited statutes with a smug certainty, twisted precedent into a weapon, and painted Crockett as reckless, defiant, unfit to challenge the system he embodied. Each phrase was meant to bruise, each legal flourish designed not to illuminate, but to overwhelm. He spoke of contempt for the court, of egregious defiance, of irreparable harm to the sanctity of judicial process. And yet, for all his thunder, his performance felt less like the pursuit of justice and more like the desperate overreach of a man trying to smother a flame before it became a fire. Jasmine Crockett sat perfectly still. She did not interrupt, did not roll her eyes, did not offer even the faintest rebuttal. Her stillness became its own kind of defiance. The contrast was stark. Thomas, pounding with words, desperate to assert dominance. Crockett, silent, her composure sharper than any counterattack. The gallery noticed. Reporters' pens slowed. Observers leaned in, their focus shifting from the man on the bench to the woman at the table. With every accusation Thomas hurled, Crockett's calm seemed to magnify the absurdity of his performance. The silence she maintained was not weakness, it was strategy. It forced the room to see his bluster for what it was, arrogance exposed, by its own volume. Thomas, perhaps sensing the shift, raised his voice further. He listed supposed infractions, painted her as uncooperative, accused her of undermining the very foundations of law. His gavel struck again and again, the sound reverberating like a drumbeat of intimidation. But with each strike, the perception began to change. What once had been the commanding sound of order now rang like desperation. Crockett's allies, seated behind her, held their breath. They had seen her fiery rebuttals in congressional hearings, her quick wit, her sharp tongue. They expected her to explode, to meet Thomas's storm with thunder of her own, but she didn't. Instead, she let him unravel, his own words tangling tighter around him with every passing minute. And it worked. The courtroom began to see what was happening. His accusations no longer felt like justice. They felt like theatre. His arguments, buried under mountains of jargon, no longer commanded awe. They invited doubt. The people watching could sense it. The imbalance of power, the futility of a man desperate to maintain control. Then came the moment that no one missed. As Thomas launched into yet another tirade, Crockett simply lifted her eyes and met his. No words, no gestures, just a look. Calm, steady, unmoving. The effect was electric. His voice faltered for the briefest second, a crack in the armor that told the room more than any speech could. He had noticed. He had felt it. And for that instant, the gavel in his hand seemed less like a weapon and more like a shield. The murmurs began again in the gallery, soft but unmistakable. The energy of the room had shifted. It was no longer Thomas towering over Crockett. It was Crockett, silent and still, holding the ground while Thomas flailed in a storm of his own making. And then came the pause. Thomas finished another string of accusations, his voice trailing, his breath heavy. The silence that followed was suffocating. Every eye in the room turned toward Crockett, waiting to see if she would finally speak, if the storm would be met with a counterstrike. She placed her hands on the table, slowly, deliberately. The sound of her chair shifting echoed louder than any of Thomas's words. And then, in a moment that left the courtroom frozen, Crockett rose to speak. Jasmine Crockett rose from her chair with the calm certainty of someone who knew that the weight of the room had already shifted. The rustle of her blazer, the scrape of her chair against the polished floor, small sounds, but in that moment they were louder than the gavel that had been striking minutes earlier. Every head turned. Every pen froze above its notepad. Even Judge Thomas, so composed in his arrogance, adjusted his posture ever so slightly, as though bracing for what was coming. She began not with anger, but with stillness. Her voice was measured, low, steady. Your Honor, she said, pausing just long enough to make the words sound like an invocation. $500 million is not a ruling. It is a warning. Not to me, but to every American watching. A warning that justice can be bought, bent, or bullied into submission. A ripple moved through the gallery. Crockett let it happen. She held the silence, eyes locked on Thomas, the pause itself an indictment. She had learned long ago that silence could be sharper than a blade when wielded at the right moment. Let us be clear, she continued, her voice rising a notch. This fine is not about contempt of court. It is about contempt for accountability, contempt for transparency, contempt for the idea that no one, no matter how powerful, should be beyond scrutiny. She turned slightly, addressing not just Thomas, but the packed room behind her. For decades, Americans have watched as scandals piled upon scandals. Vacations to private islands, flights on billionaire jets, gifts disguised as friendship, while rulings tilted in favor of those very benefactors. And every time, the public was told to look away, to trust that power could police itself. Gasps, murmurs. A clerk shifted uncomfortably. Thomas's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Crockett pressed forward, each sentence deliberate, each pause long enough to let the weight of her words settle. Now, in this courtroom, a $500 million penalty has been levied against a sitting member of Congress, not for corruption, not for bribery, but for daring to speak, for daring to question. She leaned forward on the table, her voice cutting sharper. If that is not an assault on democracy, then what is? The room hummed with energy, the tension pulling tighter with every phrase. Reporters scribbled furiously. Cameras clicked in rapid bursts. It was no longer a trial, it was theatre, and Crockett had seized the stage. Thomas attempted to interject, lifting his gavel, but she continued, undeterred. Your Honor, you speak of contempt, but what greater contempt exists than contempt for the people? What greater contempt exists than using the robe not as a symbol of impartiality, but as a shield for personal gain? The gavel struck once, twice, but it no longer carried weight. The sound felt hollow against her words. $500 million, she said again, this time with a bitter smile. Do you know what $500 million means to the communities I represent? It means every family in South Dallas could have health care. It means every child could have textbooks that aren't a decade old. It means the working poor could breathe for one moment without fear of eviction. Her voice caught slightly, not with weakness, but with controlled passion. And yet here it is, not for them, not for justice, but as a number you thought would silence me. A number you thought would send me crawling from this courtroom, my spirit crushed, my voice gone. She stood taller. But let me tell you something, Judge. My voice is not mine alone. It carries the weight of every single person who has been told they are too small to fight back. It carries the weight of every immigrant who built this country with hands that never rested. It carries the weight of every black woman who has been told to sit down, shut up, and know her place. A gasp cut through the chamber. Someone clapped, before catching themselves, stifling the sound. Even attorneys who moments earlier sat stone-faced now exchanged glances, whispers darting between them like sparks. Thomas shifted again, his fingers tapping the bench, sweat beading faintly on his forehead. Crockett did not miss it. She paused, letting the silence hang once more, then delivered the blow. And the truth, Your Honor, is that this fine is not my punishment. It is your confession. A confession that fear has replaced reason, that arrogance has replaced service, that corruption has replaced justice. The words landed like stones. The silence afterwards stretched on, heavy, unbroken. Crockett's gaze never wavered. Then, softer, she added, "But I will not be buried by your gavel, because the people who sent me here, the people who believe in democracy, the people who refuse to bow, they are louder than any fine, louder than any robe, louder than any judge who has forgotten what justice means." The room trembled with anticipation. It was no longer clear who was on trial. Every accusation Thomas had levelled now seemed to hang over him, reframed by her precision, her courage, her refusal to bend. She finished by stepping closer to the bench, her voice low but sharp enough to pierce the air. "History is watching, Judge Thomas, and it will remember not the fine you gave me, but the fear that led you to give it. It will remember that in this courtroom you tried to bury a voice, and it will remember that the voice did not break." Her final words rang like a bell. Because dignity cannot be fined, justice cannot be silenced, and truth cannot be bought. For a moment, nothing moved. The gallery sat frozen, breathless, as though the entire country had been reduced to this one room, this one confrontation. Thomas sat rigid, his gavel limp in his hand, his lips pressed into a thin line. And when she finished, the silence was deafening until the room erupted. The courtroom may have erupted in that instant, but the true explosion happened far beyond its walls. Within minutes, Crockett's words, clipped and shared by frantic reporters, began racing through social media like a wildfire catching dry grass. One line in particular lit the match. "Dignity cannot be fined, justice cannot be silenced, and truth cannot be bought." By the time Crockett had even sat back down, that line was already trending. Hashtags formed like banners of a movement. Dignity cannot be fined. Crockett vs. Thomas. Justice unbought. Twitter feeds swelled with reactions. Some shared shaky cell phone footage smuggled from inside the chamber, the grainy quality only heightening the sense that people were witnessing a forbidden moment of history. Others paired her words with side-by-side images of her standing tall, and Thomas, red-faced, gripping his gavel like a crutch. Memes blossomed overnight. One showed Thomas drowning under a wave of receipts, each labelled with the luxury trips and gifts he had accepted. Another showed Crockett as a storm, her calm composure depicted as thunderclouds rolling over a crumbling bench. TikTok spliced her pauses with slow, dramatic zooms, set to swelling orchestral scores. Instagram reels looped her mic drop line, audience gasps playing on repeat. It wasn't just the internet's usual crowd. Politicians weighed in within hours. Progressive leaders hailed her courage, calling her the voice of accountability this nation has been waiting for. Activists shared stories of their own battles with institutions that tried to silence them. Even some moderates, usually cautious to weigh in on anything touching the Supreme Court, admitted that her composure had left them shaken and inspired. Then came the celebrities, actors, musicians, athletes, all sharing her clip, all echoing her words. One Grammy-winning singer posted, "If my daughters ever need a role model for strength, I'll show them Jasmine Crockett." A star quarterback tweeted simply, 500 million reasons to stay silent. One reason not to. The truth. Likes and shares skyrocketed into the millions. And while the country laughed at the memes, there was also something deeper taking hold. Church groups began quoting her line in Sunday sermons. Community leaders held impromptu gatherings, replaying the video like scripture. Parents showed it to their children, not as politics, but as proof that standing tall mattered. Thomas, meanwhile, became a symbol of the opposite. His smirk was frozen in screenshots, remixed with captions that mocked his arrogance. Commentators on late-night shows lampooned the fine. $500 million. At that rate, sneezing in his courtroom must cost at least 10 grand. His attempt to bury a voice had instead buried his credibility in an avalanche of mockery. But, amid the laughter, was a current of something more serious, something like momentum. For once, ordinary people didn't just feel like spectators. They felt like participants. Hashtags weren't just trends, they were calls to action. Marches were announced. Petitions gained hundreds of thousands of signatures, demanding judicial accountability. Editorials poured in from every corner of the press, framing Crockett's stand as the spark of something larger. Inside Crockett's own office, phones rang off the hook. Letters flooded in, handwritten and digital alike, from Americans who said they saw themselves in her. An immigrant father wrote, "You stood for people like me who never thought we'd have a voice." A young woman from the South messaged, "They told me to stop speaking up at work because I was too loud. Tonight I saw you, and I know I won't stop." The ripple effect was undeniable. For every person mocking Thomas, 10 more lifted Crockett higher, turning her into something larger than herself. She was no longer just a congresswoman. She had become a symbol, the embodiment of defiance turned into dignity, of truth spoken against impossible odds. And yet, as social media burned, bright with hashtags, as the country reveled in the drama, the most pivotal shift wasn't happening online at all. Something was stirring in the very chamber where it had all begun. Because while Twitter mocked and Instagram celebrated, those inside the courtroom itself had witnessed more than a viral moment. They had seen the cracks in a titan's armor, and some of them were already beginning to act on it. But the biggest surprise came not from Twitter, but from inside the courtroom itself. In the end, this was never just about a fine. It was never about numbers scrawled on a page, or the hollow clang of a gavel striking wood. It was about power, how it is abused, and how it can be reclaimed. Judge Thomas tried to bury Jasmine Crockett beneath the weight of $500 million. But what he didn't count on was that dignity weighs more than gold, and truth echoes louder than arrogance. Crockett's stand wasn't only hers. It belonged to every person who has ever been told they were too small, too loud, too different to matter. It belonged to those who have been silenced, overlooked, or pushed aside. In that courtroom, she became a mirror for a nation desperate to see courage reflected back at them. And when she turned the tables on the man who tried to humiliate her, the message was clear. Dignity cannot be priced, and justice cannot be auctioned off. But this story does not end in that room. It lives on with us. How we share it, how we carry it, how we let it remind us that no voice is too small to rise, no truth too fragile to survive the storm. So if this moment spoke to you, don't let it fade. Share this story. Subscribe to this channel. Join this movement that refuses to bow to arrogance, that lifts up the voices too often ignored. that believes in standing tall even when the odds are stacked high, because in the end, justice is never fined, it is earned.